Welcome to Pen and Brush. For any of you who have not been here, I'm Dawn Delicat, the Associate Executive Director, and this is Janice Sands, our Executive Director. For those of you who may not know, Pen and Brush is a 125-year-old organization dedicated to under-recognized women artists and writers. Thank you. Yes, it is absolutely amazing. We bet that our founders never thought it would still be needed in 2019, sadly, but here we are together to keep at it and keep the dialogue going. So the exhibition around you is an example of what we do to help expose under-recognized artists. We do have a few superstars in the room. Jean Shin is one who's above you, Martha Wilson's downstairs, Maren Hassinger, Linda Stein. And those women are graciously showing in solidarity to kind of bring attention to all the under-recognized women who are on the walls next to them. So if you have any questions about our exhibit, all work is for sale. 75% goes straight to the artist. 25% comes back in to feed our work here at Pen and Brush. We also publish a journal for writers. We have a reading tomorrow night. So if any of you are readers or into poetry, please check out our journal on the desk or come to one of our readings the first Wednesday of every month. And if you have any questions about our work here, you can find us at the desk. So without further ado, I will give you Janice Sands.
Thank you. It's for the women on the walls, actually. It's wonderful to see this room filled with as many people as are in here tonight. It's a celebration over and over again of women and their triumphs, which are so hard to come by. I was reading from the catalog that you have put together, which is a beautiful piece, and it struck me immediately that so much of the narrative there is our narrative. There's almost no difference. It's a tale about under-recognition, women using names that are not their own so that nobody would know that a piece of work was done by a female. Pen and Brush has experienced all of these things and realized over the years that to be successful, it had to do a couple of things that I think you all have done too. One of them is to create a community where women feel supported and their work is recognized at least by their cohort. I also think that if we're ever going to make any real progress, and we have made a lot, I like to think that that women of Pen and Brush in 1894 said, you just wait, we're going to work for suffrage for women, and when we finally get the right to vote, things will change. No. So clearly we all have a lot of work to do, but I think that what it's going to take actually is for organizations like the AAA and you all being part of that as women and coming together as women, and our organization and many others out there to come together. We need, among many other things, the sheer weight and force of all of our efforts together for us to really find a place for visual artists and in our case also for the writers of poetry and literary fiction. We do publish those works as well as provide places for the visual artists to be exhibited, because we think it's important actually to create, and I think there's something that you all do that's comparable to this, to create a kind of a repository, an archive of the work. It is critical that work not be lost. We can't show every female artist or publish every female writer, but what we can do is archive their work, which does many things. It preserves it, makes it available for people to read it. It also provides provenance so that at any point in the future that can be looked up, and it's a registry, which I think is terribly important. A lot of the work is lost over time, so we're doing what we can to see that doesn't happen. I think you all are doing that to make sure that it doesn't happen for women who have been working in abstract art. So that's what I have to say. Welcome. I think we have a great panel. It's going to be really interesting to hear what everybody has to say. And I'll give you back to Dawn, who will get you started.
Okay, I'd like to introduce my comrade in concocting this event tonight. I'm so glad that she did approach me and we've got this night together. So Joanne Freeman, who's the vice president of AAA.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our event, Beyond the Gendered Lens, from the AA exhibition, Blurring Boundaries, to a larger discussion of women in contemporary art. I've already been introduced. I'm Joanne Freeman. And first and foremost, I would like to thank our wonderful hosts this evening, Pen and Brush. I would like to thank Lisbeth Redfield, Parker Daly, Janice Sands, and a very special thanks to Dawn, who went far beyond making this possible. Thank you for raising this sculpture so that we could fit more seats. I'd like to thank Jim Osman, our president, Ann Rusinoff, and Liz Ainsley on publicity and communications. Thank you to Emily Berger, Creighton Michael, and the curator Rebecca DiGiovanna for creating the currently touring exhibition Blurring Boundaries, The Women of AAA, 1936 to the Present. And of course, a very special thank you to our guest panelists, Virginia Anderson, Nancy Princenthal, and Karen Wilkin.
So, we're going to get right to the questions. The first one is for Rebecca DiGiovanna, who is our curator of Blurring Boundaries. Some artists and critics argue that gender-based shows encourage tokenism and ghettoize women artists. Others, of course, say that after a long history of shows featuring only men, this is a necessary corrective. So, Rebecca, we'd like to know what your thoughts are on the subject, tokenism or corrective?
Is this on? No. Hello. Okay. I think it's an interesting question because I think back to my personal experience when we were initially in the planning stages of discussing this show and reaching out to members as a call. And we did receive, some hesitation or even refusal for some who did not want to participate based off of these very ideas that maybe it was, othering in some sort of way. There was an expression that maybe because individually they hadn't experienced inherent sexism in the art world, maybe this show wasn't necessary. And that stigma and that fear is something that I understand, and I don't necessarily disagree with. But I think it's important to look toward the larger picture and understand kind of the context of the time that we're living in, where we're very much trying to reconstruct a historical narrative that has been overtly male. And we are actively trying to correct discrepancies in not only our history, but in museum staffing and museum collections. And I think a very revealing state of affairs is just looking at institutional announcements from this past month where the Guggenheim, for instance, just announced that they've hired their first full-time Black female curator, or you have the BMA who has just started their 2020 initiative to only collect female identifying artists. And so I think the fact that we're celebrating those kinds of milestones still in 2019 is kind of a very good indicator of why these kinds of shows are still necessary. And I think any exhibition that provides a platform for conversation that's critical and is in a safe environment is going to be constructive. And in the case of Blurring Boundaries, I think it's important to note that we never really conceived this show to discuss any sort of kind of feminist stratagem, as it will. It was and is always about abstraction at its core, and it's supposed to elucidate an intergenerational conversation between past and present members within an organization that has always qualified its membership based on their ability to use abstraction rather than through their gender.
Virginia, we're going to get to you in just a minute, excuse me, to hear about your show and your initiative for your museum. But before we do, I'd like to ask Emily Berger, who is an artist in Blurring Boundaries, to talk a little bit about this issue of gender. Does working in abstraction, relying on formal structures and non-objective content, remove the issue of gender? And I realize you're speaking just for you and not for an entire sex. Does abstraction take work beyond the gendered lens? And to what extent does the creative artist experience herself as gendered or not?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And I initially my reaction was no, or yes, or I have no idea. And then I had to really think about it. So I'm sorry, you'll have to forgive me, I wrote down a few things because otherwise I won't remember. So my first question, it's a question in answer to your question, which is for the artist or the viewer. I think there's a big difference. There's a sense of freedom and abstraction from notions of gender in that less is revealed sexually, personally, politically, socially than in representational work. Of course, some artists deal explicitly with gender in their work. Otherwise, I tend to think that it does not enter in much in terms of how we consider our own work. I think part of the motivation for becoming an artist is the freedom from convention, socially, the way you live, freedom in your work. We don't walk around thinking of ourselves as women artists. We think of ourselves as artists. It's how we are perceived that makes a difference in our careers, how our work is interpreted, and sometimes in our self-esteem, unfortunately. In terms of how we may be seen and treated, abstraction is no protection, in the sense that we cannot escape the associations with certain qualities in an art that can be gendered, materials, techniques, colors, shapes, etc., that are considered masculine or feminine, despite our desire for freedom from stereotyping. This is an anecdote. This is from my past, my deep past. I had a well-known professor at Skowhegan who looked at one of my paintings and saw it through a gendered lens right away. Though it was abstract, it was a painting of overlapping regular marks in a range of warm colors, reds, oranges, etc. His comment was that women, because of all those lipsticks, had a good grasp of the variety of these colors. This is true. Even then, I knew it was a ridiculous reference, but on the other hand, I've never forgotten it. And that kind of thing makes you think twice about the kind of color you use, and other things, like you're not in the conversation really, you're in some other conversation. The women's room, where the conversation is about lipstick, where what is considered traditionally feminine is second class. So you can try and ignore it, or you can embrace it, or reject it, but really on some level you have to engage it or acknowledge it. Sorry, I'm reading. Did I laugh? Not at that age, no. I think I just stood there. You know, what do you say? And the thing is, he was a really nice guy. He was a sweetheart. He just didn't know what he didn't know what he was talking about. I mean, that's part of what makes things difficult, right? You have these personal relationships with people, and then they say these things to you. One more personal anecdote, and I want to remind you that in those good old days, I did not have one female professor in studio art. I was welding. I loved it. I loved the whole manual labor aspect of it, the helmet, the mask, the gloves, the sparks. Because I'm a human being, it was fun and empowering. My professor took a look at my sculpture and drawled, well, I guess you could be a lady welder. I knew that was trivializing. I knew he meant it as an insult and the feminine as a slur. Clearly, I was first and foremost a girl. The sculpture was irrelevant. But those were the bad old days. I believe that historically, as a modern movement in the West, abstraction represented a new freedom for artists, and therefore, more women felt free to participate, and in some places, like in AAA, were also accepted as equals more readily. It was new, and it was freeing for everyone. In Blurring Boundaries, we wanted to showcase women because, as women, we've been pushed aside, neglected, and forgotten, not in AAA. In fact, one of the significant aspects of AAA is the prominent and now equal participation of women in its history, as you saw in the presentation, and as Rebecca mentioned. The artist Alice Adams, who with painter Jane Logman suggested some time ago that we do a Women of AAA exhibition, wrote a wonderful essay for the Blurring Boundaries catalog, which you can read, with a telling anecdote. She was asked to judge 2 landscape gardens and to guess which was the woman's and which was the man's. She said she could tell the difference right away. The one that clearly cost more to make was the man's.
Virginia, this next question is for you. The Baltimore Museum of Art has announced a year-long vision initiative for 2020 to celebrate female-identifying artists. Can you tell us some of the thinking behind this initiative, and in turn, how your show, by their creative force, American Women Modernists, came to fruition? And also, what do you mean by female identifying artists?
Let me know if you can't hear me. You can hear me? Yes? Okay, good. So 2020 vision, initially, it's been in the planning stages for a couple of years, and it was in thinking about the, of course, centennial of women's suffrage. And wanting to mark that with some kind of an exhibition. And initially it started off as an exhibition, and then it became really a museum-wide initiative. So it really grew to a group of exhibitions, a series of programming, and then, as we announced recently, really thinking about acquisitions and the impact that we can have on our collection. And that was really, just sort of thinking about, it's a one-year focus on acquiring works by women artists through purchase. And we know it won't change everything, but we hope it will change something. We know there's a lot of room to catch up on. So the initiative was really pushed in a museum-wide direction by the president of our board of trustees, Claire Siegel, and she really sort of, said, let's take this to a museum-wide place. And I think, as we were thinking about it recently, we became grateful and cognizant of the strong history of women directors, curators, and collectors that have really shaped the history of the museum. Our first director, Florence Nightingale Levy, was a woman. She founded the museum, and she was the director from 1923 to 1926. Adeline Breeskin was a formative curator and the director of the museum from 1942 to 1962. Most recently, we had Doreen Berger, who was there from 98 to 2015. So between, the series of really impactful directors, and then of course the Cone collection, really, right, if you think about our wonderful collection of modernist art, was put together by 2 sisters, Dr. Clara Bell and her sister Etta Cone. And the 2 of them really, traveling and acquiring these amazing works by Matisse and Picasso, among others. So, I think that impact and really thinking about that history is one that we want to acknowledge and be mindful of as well. I guess I can also talk about the exhibition. So I'm relatively new to the museum. I've been there for about 15 months. And when I came on board, this initiative was already in place. I got to know the collection. I got to see our what we had on view. And then, of course, right, the joy as a curator is that you get to go into storage. And you get to see what's behind the scenes as well as what is, at least at the moment, on view. And I realized really that we had some wonderful pieces, both already on view and that, you know, it would be great to bring out from the vaults. And so the concept of this exhibition came together. The show focuses on works by American women artists, and the works themselves date from around 1915 to around 1955. So it's a fairly eclectic presentation. I want to, you know, really the title, I guess maybe too, would be important to address. We were thinking about what do we title an exhibition like this? Of course, when you think about modernism, you, in some ways, come to Virginia Woolf, right? And thinking about a room of one's own. But that was a little too evident. But when you read through A Room of One's Own, she has this wonderful passage, which is actually very appropriate for the location we find ourselves in tonight, in which she talks about how women have been so contained for so long, women's creative energies have been so pent up for so long, that by their creative force, they must needs burst through these walls with pens and brushes and business and politics. So, right, all of those forces coming out together. And when we sort of thought about that quote, it seemed that by their creative force was really kind of a great, you know, championing phrase for this exhibition. Very timely in thinking about the turn of the century and the first, you know, 40 or 50 years thereafter. Yeah. And Gertrude Stein. Sure, as an author, you mean, or?
As an inspiring woman.
Oh, of course. Well, of course, as a woman artist and a woman collector, yes, very much so. I mean, the cones would not have been the cones if it weren't for Gertrude Stein, right?
Or Sarah.
Or Sarah. And we have Sadie Mae, Blanche Adler. I mean, really, you know, I could go on. Yeah. It's a long and rich history. Go on, she says, go on. Yes.
Virginia, one more quick question. How do you think this year-long initiative will impact how the museum goes forward?
I think that's a terrific question. I've already begun to see it come into play, right? I mean, obviously, for the exhibitions that we have planned for next year, by their creative forces, the first show that opens up, I have another exhibition that I'm installing next week called Freeform, which focuses on mid-century craft by a small group of women artists. We have just a whole spring series of exhibitions that will be opening up. I mean, it really is museum-wide. Our entire contemporary wing is going to be rehung with a group of solo exhibitions in the spring and then another group of solo exhibitions in the fall. So as we're planning these exhibitions, we are being mindful not only of next year, but also the years to come, right? As you know, museums plan their exhibitions several years out, so we're already paying attention to the balance and representation in our planned exhibitions for the next few years as we look ahead. And then also in terms of acquisitions, being mindful, you know, as always, it's a balance between artistic excellence and social equity. And right, you're looking at the art, you know, anything that comes to mind, whether it's a gift or whether it's a purchase, you're always keeping in mind those two kind of factors. So trying to balance those together.
Thank you. Thank you. Karen, let's continue with you. In your essay, Beyond the Sea, written for Art and Antiques magazine in 2013, you write, plainly we categorize Frankenthaler, of course Helen, at our peril. Far from being defined by a single early painting, she resists easy labels. The only identifying title she herself ever accepted was painter, always refusing the qualifying adjective woman. Of course, no qualifiers were necessary since she was not only as good as any of her male colleagues of her generation, but better than most. It's time to look beyond mountains and sea. Can you elaborate on how her work was received by audiences and critics in her day, and how that narrative has evolved in relation to current attitudes toward gender and identity?
When Princenthal first started showing, there was enthusiasm for the energy of her work, and many very significant people took it very seriously, including Clement Greenberg. She showed Adolf Gottlieb selected a work of hers for a show at Coots Gallery, where artists that showed at Coots chose people. She was fresh out of Bennington at the time. And when she started exhibiting more regularly, where she was starting to stain and doing paintings that were as often as delicate in color as Mountains and Sea, that was sometimes seen by critics as feminine, pretty. There's been a certain amount of recent stupidity about that, where women critics have said, well, she was a feminist without knowing it because she made it all right to make pretty pictures. Helen never made a pretty picture in her life. She was fearless in the studio. And not all the paintings were delicate in color. The one person who really got this was Frank O'Hara, who in his introductory essay for her solo exhibition, her mini retrospective at the Jewish Museum, when she was incredibly young for an artist of that generation. He's the one person who says her work can be sullen, her work can be truculent, her work can be, she's not afraid to make it whatever it needs to be for the mood. No one else said that. And I give O'Hara full marks for that. She was enormously proud of what she called her darker paintings. She was enormously proud of what she called her darker palette. And she knew she was a spectacular colorist. I mean, that was deeply ingrained in the way she worked. She couldn't help it. But she made a lot of paintings that were using colors that were not at the high chroma end of the spectrum. And in fact, she was so tired of being always talked about as a wonderful colorist that we worked on a show together that we called The Darker Palette. And it was enormous fun going around and finding these, black and dark brown and murky Frankenthalers, which had as much color in them as any of the chromatic paintings. But she wanted to be known that way. What's happening now is, I think, very gratifying. There were artists of her who were older than she was, who were playing the I was a marginalized artist card, who were getting considerably more attention than she was for a while. That's not true anymore. I'm very happy about that, because I think she's better than most of them. What is happening is there seems to be an effort to reposition her as an abstract expressionist. MoMA has put up a wonderful painting of hers called Jacob's Ladder, which was the first painting of hers that they acquired in 1957. It's a 57 painting. That's pretty impressive for someone who was born in December of 1928. A wonderful picture, hasn't been up in years. I'm thrilled it's up there. But it's in a room called Action Painting 2. They've gotten rid of any isms except surrealism. And she's in there with Joan Mitchell, Grace Hardigan, Lee Krasner. There's a very nice Pasloff work on paper. I think the head of Stern is in that room. And one Pollock. I mean, what's that about? And there's a great deal of talk about Frankenthaler as an abstract expressionist, when in fact everything she did was showing people, including artists who were older than she was, a way out of the gestural, contingent, wet into wet kind of abstract expressionism. She led the way into something completely different. And I cannot say often enough, stop calling her an abstract expressionist. That whirling sound is Helen revolving in her brain.
Related to what you were talking about earlier, Frank O'Hara being her champion and so many others not being her champion. In your book, Color is Field, American Painting 1950 to 1975, there's an essay by Carl Belz in which he talks about Helen Frankenthaler's work. Specifically, there's a section in which he responds to Harold Rosenberg's negative review of her painting. And I'm going to quote that negative review here in very brief. "The artist is the medium of her medium. Her part is limited to selecting aesthetically acceptable colors from the partly accidental behavior of her color. To that and the rest of the negative criticism, Belz responds, and we can hear his sarcasm. So, Frankenthaler didn't grasp the metaphysics of action painting, and her softness lacked objectivity. Not physical enough on the one hand, she was not rational enough on the other, which meant in Bob Dylan's memorable sung words, she was just like a woman." Can you comment on the stereotypes and contradictory attributes women had to juggle to be taken seriously and compete with their male peers, and particularly with regard to those kinds of reviews?
We all miss Carl Belz for many reasons. Some of us think that Harold Rosenberg is a joke, and the whole idea of action painting and the canvas as an arena for action. If you read a very interesting article by Clement Greenberg called How Art Writing Got Its Bad Name, he tells a story that was told him by Jackson Pollock. On a drive with Harold Rosenberg out to Long Island, Pollock invented this notion of action painting, and Rosenberg bought it. And it has been circulating ever since, and is now enshrined in 2 galleries in MoMA. So look up the piece; it's very entertaining. The issue with Frankenthaler is exactly what I was talking about. People seeing work that wasn't gestural, that didn't have the heroic, wet and wet contingent. Every gesture is a declaration of my personality, and they misread it. They also did not understand that she wasn't simply pouring color onto canvas on the ground. There were some very interesting films of her working, and you see her down there, and yes, she starts by pouring the paint, but she's sponging out, she's adding, she's moving it around with her hands. She is willing this sometimes. You wonder if she hasn't moved the paint by force of her personality, but she was not only accepting what was happening, she was reacting to what was happening. And it was not the model that certain critics thought was what was heroic. I mean, she drank very little. She was an uptown girl. Yes, when she was involved with Clement Greenberg, she was downtown, she was part of the scene. But Helen always had a kind of reserve. She was not, like Joan Mitchell, going to be one of the boys. She was not, like Lee Krasner, going to make herself subservient to anybody to advance someone else's career. She was totally her own person, and she was doing this on her own terms. And however much a well-brought-up, nice young lady from the Upper East Side she was, in the studio she was absolutely fearless, no holds barred. There's also been a lot of recent, very unpleasant writing about her, mostly by Anna Chave, saying that she used her money and her social position to advance her art. Joan Mitchell's family had infinitely more money than Helen Frankenthaler's. No one seems to mind about that. And one of the proofs that was offered of Helen's using her social position to advance her career was that when she was married to Bob Motherwell, they gave dinner parties. I rest my case.
This next question is for Nancy Princenthal. Nancy, in two of your recent books, you raise the issue of identity, since that is also the topic for this evening, the gendered lens and beyond it. So that prompts a couple of questions. In Agnes Martin, Her Life and Art, you report that Martin did not identify as a woman artist. Indeed, she often did not identify as a woman at all. And you quote her as saying, "Art shouldn't have a gender. I'm for keeping the field of art as it is, neither masculine nor feminine." But of course, art was a male world, and before the women's movement, female artists were navigating sexist waters without a sextant. How much of an outlier was Martin in terms of her attitude? Where along the spectrum did some of her peers register?
Is this on?
Yes.
Complicated set of nested questions.
Yeah.
And I'll see if I can sort of tackle them in order. I'll probably leave some out. But I think I want to first answer the question of whether her attitude made her an outlier. And I think by being an outlier, you mean wanting her work to be seen as work rather than as work that's identified with a particular aspect of her character, her background, her place in the world. And I think we've already heard, from Karen about Princenthal and from Emily about her own work, that this notion of a feminine aesthetic is not one that actually gets much support on the ground. Outlier in terms of just straight ahead being seen as a woman, even if she didn't consider herself a woman in any simple way. Yeah, it was a really, really tough time, the 60s. Worse in some ways, and the 60s, early 70s, I think, than it had been earlier. I think, the wonderful sort of survey we've had of women in the early years of AAA demonstrates that, women had a better shot in the pre-war and wartime years than they did afterwards, which is all stuff that's been covered quite a bit in all sorts of women's landmark literature from, Beauvoir and Betty Friedan on. But no question, Martin was an outlier in all sorts of ways. She was an outlier geographically. She grew up in rural Canada, Macklin, Saskatchewan, Vancouver. She moved to the Northwest in her early adulthood, northwest of the United States, Washington State. She spent 10 years, I'm sure all of you know this history, or some of you do, 10 years all together living in New York, and she didn't like it very much. Most of her life, she spent in rural places, principally in New Mexico, so that made her an outlier. And of course, being a lesbian, being a closeted lesbian made it only tougher for her. Having schizophrenia made it tough for her. So there are a lot of ways that she operated, with aspects of her identity as a kind of obstacle. Maybe handicap is too harsh a word. But she was also really, really adamant, and I think we've heard this already also, about that not being the point. I also love the line that Emily used about abstraction not being any protection for women artists. Clearly it's not. Women were seen as women, whether they were making abstract art or the most explicitly autobiographical figurative art. But Martin did see her work as transcending all of those conditions of her personal life and of her physical being. She really believed not only that artists should all be treated equally, but that her work represented universal values. That actually did make her something of an abstract expressionist as I see it, that sort of commitment to these transcendent experiences of joy, of harmony, of serenity, of ecstasy. That's what she was about. But I also want to say, and this is further to the question of being an outlier, that despite her choices of where she lived and how she worked and how the conditions under which she set up her living and working circumstances, she really wanted to succeed. She didn't believe her art was complete unless people were seeing it. She wanted a lot of people to see it. She wanted to be successful. It wasn't principally a wish driven by material concerns. She didn't care that much about money. She did like fancy cars, but that's about it. She liked giving money away at the end of her life when she had a lot of it. But it was really important to her that her work be taken seriously. And of course, one way of saying that is that it be considered alongside the most successful artists of her time, and those were mostly men.
Nancy, continuing with you. In your most recent book, Unspeakable Acts, Women, Art, and Sexual Violence in the 1970s, you write, I'm sorry, I forgot to put my glasses on. The fault lines that opened almost from the start in the feminist movement of the 1970s, prominently including race and gender identity, are hardly less divisive now than they were then. Indeed, the increasingly challenging question of what defines a woman had not yet been raised. How has the full range of gender identity, including transgender men and women, influenced perceptions of female artists and perhaps female aesthetics?
More easy questions. Okay, so, that question, the question of considering the experiences of women who are subject to violence, who aren't in a conventional position on the male to female spectrum, the whole notion of a non-binary understanding of gender was pretty foreign to artists and to society at large, to culture at large in the 1970s, which is where the book Unspeakable Acts really stakes it. It's where I start my exploration in that book. Of course, it quickly, in second wave feminism, and the feminism of the early and mid 1970s, became very divisive. As we all know about the history of the feminist movement in those years, women who weren't straight became early on quite irritated about the fact that they were being written out of the agenda. We all know as well that there were racial divisions that were very harmful to the movement right from the beginning. And I think both of those kinds of divisions, the racial division and the straight gay division, were exacerbated around the issue of sexual violence. And I think that's particularly true of race. And I think that's true because there's always been, there remains a horrific disproportion in the rates at which men are accused, convicted, especially convicted, and incarcerated for sexual crimes, for crimes of rape and assault. And it's the case for incarceration in general in this country that way more black men than white men suffer from that fate. So it became a very tough thing for African American women to get behind, this idea that rape should be at the top of anyone's feminist agenda. Even if black and white women were going to get together on a feminist agenda, sexual violence was not going to be a primary concern. I'm happy to say that, if we look past the 70s at work that's being made in response to sexual violence, we see the kinds of diversity and openness to addressing difficult questions that were not possible for women making the first, kind of first ever performance works and also pictorial works that address sexual assault.
This next question is directed to all of you, so I hope we can get a nice overlapping conversation going. Put these glasses on again. In her book, 9th Street Women, Mary Gabriel states, art historians and philosophers have taught that one is unable to understand art deeply without understanding the time and place in which a work was created. The women artists working at mid-century were part of a rapidly changing political and social environment that encompassed the Great Depression and World War II. And then, of course, and I'm not quoting her now, we had World War II to the beginning of the women's movement, and then the women's movement to now. So a lot of different societal situations. Broadly speaking, how did this social and political environment affect the activities and work of women artists? Creighton, let's start with you, because you've spoken on the history of the women in American abstract artists. So let's get your thoughts, but I'd like everyone to jump in and agree and disagree. It's okay.
Wow. I think, what part of that question do you want to, I mean, there's a lot of things.
Okay, let's talk about between the Great Depression and World War II, which would be the time of the founding of American abstract art.
Well, I think that the biggest problem was for people, for artists, male or female, and probably more for female, was to live, to be able to do your work, and to find a way to support that. And when I Rosalind Bingelsdorf Brown the reason she had to quit painting was that she had to make a living. And she went back to school, became a writer and an educator, because according to the quote, only one painter per family could exist. So I think that on a primal level, that is really where a lot of the idea, and you're looking at a time when the financial world or the economy was extremely difficult. Had it not been for the WPA, a number of artists, especially abstract artists, would have not existed. And so I think that there are multiple, and then within that, and as as things change, I mean, also the impact of World War II, where there was a greater sense of equality, let's say, between male and female because of necessity. Now, so I guess that sort of flips back after, in the post-war time, and we kind of go back to start again. But, I mean, that is such a wide-ranging, multi-layered kind of question and time. And I think in the time we have, I don't know we could really, other than just kind of go over the simplest parts.
Well, you made a good start, so let's keep this engine moving. That's good, thank you. Rebecca, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, so I think Creighton made an interesting point in kind of the aftermath of the Great Depression and World War II. There was kind of, in the 1930s, this almost perceived sort of equality that people thought they had reached, I think because you had organizations like the WPA where women artists were working alongside their male counterparts, and they were receiving equal pay. And so there was kind of a sense that there wasn't really a necessity to engage in these sorts of conversations. And then you had men, of course, returning to war, and you had returning from war, you had European refugee artists who were coming, and you had the surrealists who were notoriously masochistic, and they have anecdotes of, you know, dressing their wives up in ridiculous outfits and makeup and having contests of who could dress and adorn their wives the best. And so you had this kind of permeating masochism that really started to inch its way into the art world. And I think looking specifically at what was going on with abstraction, abstraction is not something that's inherently easy to understand. And so after all these, the Great Depression and World War II, America really wanted something that was very clear and had a very clear political agenda. And so if you're looking at it from the perspective of women in abstraction, and I think this is one of the unifying forces with American abstract artists, is that abstraction and women were on that, were outsiders, essentially, together. They weren't accepted by American society because they weren't easy to understand, because they were too new. They didn't meet the standards of their European predecessors. They didn't kind of have the tradition behind them. And so I think this is one of the really big reasons why, from the inception of AAA, women have been, you know, such an integral part of this organization, because they were working towards this mutual goal of advocating for abstraction.
Virginia?
Yeah, I think just to build on that, thinking about a couple of the artists that are included in our show at the BMA, Irene Rice Pereira is an interesting example to think about in this context, because, you know, she's someone who, on one hand, would sign her paintings just with her first initial, right, I Rice Pereira, so you wouldn't necessarily know that she was a woman artist. But she also helped found the Design Laboratory School here in New York, which was a WPA-founded program that was built on the Bauhaus model in the late 1930s. And that was, you know, an opportunity for her, thinking about it from an institutional framework, to reach out to peers and colleagues in the field. She was corresponding with scientists and manufacturers, because she was very interested in learning about new materials and, you know, sort of thinking about media for painting. She was working on glass. She was working with corrugated plexiglass. And so she was, you know, in correspondence with presumably many male counterparts across the country. But then when that funding, when the WPA funding ended in 1939, the school closed down, that avenue closed down, right? Also thinking about it from a local or regional level, also, I think that's a really important framework for women artists who didn't have the opportunities to exhibit their work. You had regional institutions that were founded, like the Municipal Art Society is one in Baltimore that began and really played a fundamental role in terms of providing an exhibition space for women artists to get together and to show their work, right? Much again like the place that we find ourselves in tonight. Oh, and I'm sorry, I also neglected to address your earlier question about female identifying artists, so I'm gonna loop around for a second and just tackle that one briefly. And I think that, well, the idea of gender as a spectrum, right, came up earlier, and I think that's exactly right, that in this day and age we become more and more aware of gender expression as existing on a spectrum. And so when you make a claim to women artists, what does that mean? We need to be cognizant of that a little bit. And so women, you know, artists who identify as female is a category that we are, an aspect of that categorization that we wanted to engage with in terms of recognizing that gender exists on a spectrum and can be manifest in very different ways. So in our day and age, when it really behooves us to take an intersectional approach to thinking about identity, it's the challenge, right? In staking a claim in an era in which we recognize the structural obstacles that women artists have faced, but we also want to be cognizant about being inclusive in art inclusivity. So I hope that helps answer your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
There's another aspect that we haven't talked about, and it's the proverbial 800-pound elephant in the room. And that is some of this restriction and marginalization was self-imposed. I mean, there was not the kind of expectation among even extremely talented and ambitious women who were making art that they were going to forge ahead the way their male counterparts would be. You mentioned Judith Rothschild, who was one of Hoffman's most gifted students and started exhibiting wonderful paintings with Jane Street. She then married a writer who thought that New York was evil and corrupt and stultifying to creativity, and he carried her off very willingly to Monterey, California, which was not exactly a hotbed of creativity. You know, Cannery Row, it was mostly about fish. And they lived there for quite a while. Her family made furniture. It wasn't Ethan Allen, but it was something like that. She was extremely wealthy. He lived very happily on her avails. They would go off to Provincetown every summer, where she fell under the spell of Karl Knaths, not one of our more distinguished painters. And her work, which had been so exciting and so promising, then he ran off with his literary agent, and she decided maybe she shouldn't stay in Monterey. So she came back to New York, where she reconnected with her friends, who included Robert Motherwell and other people who encouraged her to get back on track. And her late work was really, really exciting. But there was this long period when she was perfectly happy to be married to this guy who was living on her money, and she was not exhibiting, she was not making work with the ambition she was capable of. And there are countless stories like that. Pat Pasloff, very, very daring in the studio, so subservient to her husband Milton Resnick that when I congratulated her when she was in her 60s on getting a Guggenheim, she said it should have been Milton. Not a nice story.
Very beautiful show that you curated at the Resnick Pasloff Foundation. Virginia, did you want to add something there? Nancy, what would you like to add, or? What we're talking about are the circumstances of the time, whether they were financial or societal, whether they had to do with sexual politics or, you know, just simply poverty, the war, all of the things that were going on from pre-war, then post-war, then the women's movement to now. How did all of those kinds of things, situations, affect women artists? Big topic, so just pick something, pick anything.
I thought that's what it was. And I actually kind of wanted to go in it quickly from a slightly different direction, which is that, you know, in my life in the art world, in my life as a writer, it has begun to seem that the place where I entered, which is probably true for a number of us on the panel and in the room, you know, the 1970s was sort of the heyday of the belief that you could eliminate social circumstances, you could eliminate biography, you could eliminate anything in the interest of getting at the truth of the work you were addressing, which was, of course, you know, great big minimalist work made by, and it now looks like a very strange proposition, because when you go back to the earlier years of abstraction, for instance, there was an understanding that spiritualism, for instance, which is something that's gotten some renewed attention lately, was absolutely fundamental to the creation and the experience of the kind of work that Kandinsky or Mondrian or Thank you. Etc. is the name I'm looking for. So yes, you know, of course, all of us in whatever walk of life, but artists most particularly, because artists do tend to live in a more precarious way, are hugely affected by the social and economic and political circumstances of their time, as well as, of course, by their biography, by their spiritual inclinations. I think it's a great relief in some ways that we're able now to embrace the full spectrum of these concerns when we're trying to talk about work and to understand from an artist's perspective what's going on, what's being made.
Would anyone like to add to any of that? I've got a question for you, Emily, but feel free to jump in there. Your anecdote about being in art school and having to deal with that kind of sexism, even by a really nice teacher, is one that I bet almost every woman in this room has experienced. And actually, when we get to some Q&A, I'd love to hear some of those stories if you're willing to share. I'm wondering how much of that kind of attitude affected you into your early career as an artist. I mean, it's horrible stuff that was laid on women.
Yeah. I think that's a very difficult question to answer. I mean, for one thing, I can't remember. But for another, you know, I think that you looked for people who would be supportive. That's what I did. I mean, I ignored a lot of what people said to me. I was very protective of my work. I sought out, I seemed to be pretty good at seeking out and finding people like Marvin Brown when I was in college, who was my advisor and is an AAA member. Like when I went to grad school, I sought out Jenny Snyder, who was teaching undergrads at the time. I befriended other women painters, particularly. And I think that, you know, you make community where you can. And there was certainly plenty of support to be found. And I mean, I guess if I had advice for younger artists, if they were suffering that sort of thing, that's what I would tell them to do. I don't know what else you can do. I mean, other than organize. And, I mean, things have changed, you know. I'm sure a lot of the male professors can't get away with what they could get away with then.
Where would women artists be now without the women's movement?
Same place.
Feel free, jump in.
Where would the women's movement be without artists? There's some synergy there.
Yeah. Would anyone else like to respond to that question? What have we not discussed that you think is important to bring up in the context of the gendered lens and looking beyond the gendered lens?
There's something this is also going to be me trying to recover a dropped part of the question that you asked. And it has to do with something that's, I think, sort of very much abroad in the land of contemporary abstraction. It has to do with touch and craft. And it's another way of getting at what has been described and then dismissed as a feminist aesthetic. And in relationship, for instance, to Agnes Martin, it's the question that always comes up about the relationship between her work and, say, textiles. And of course, she was identified as making feminine kinds of grids because they were like woven cloth, which is an analogy that wouldn't necessarily be made to, say, Solowitz grids or Bryce Martin's grids or other artists of the era making grids. And, you know, it made Martin absolutely incensed to have those kind of connections drawn, even though she was quite close, of course, to Lenore Tawney, who, they named each other's art, they influenced each other a great deal. You know, I want to say that I think that too is a misattribution, that, you know, craft is something that doesn't belong to men or women. Handmaidness is not a gendered attribute. But I do think that it's worth thinking about the relationship in this moment between, Whitney just opened a huge show dedicated to, you know, the made object, the craft. What feminism has contributed to making that embrace possible.
Yeah, I think the most interesting thing for me is the beyond part. Because as has been said many times by all of us, the artists that we've been thinking about and interested in have never described themselves as women artists any more than their male counterparts describe themselves as men artists. I mean, maybe that should start happening. It might clarify a bit. But there are so many difficult questions. I mean, do you want to be included in something because you're good at it, or do you want to be included because you fulfill certain categories? And that's a very uncomfortable question when you are trying to redress imbalances. And unfortunately, it's a question that comes to mind, and it definitely comes to mind in, for example, the installation at the New Museum of Modern Art. You start wondering about why certain choices were made. But what you were saying about the textile reminded me of something I've forgotten for years. It was an artist who will remain nameless, who's quite well known as a public feminist, and she was talking about her work, and she said, and then I decided to express my femininity by working with traditional women's techniques like stitchery. And I thought, well, what difference does it make what you're using? I mean, we're all of us bringing all of our own baggage, everything, as you said, which has shaped us. The artist, to what we're looking at, the artist is loading whatever he or she is making with all of his or her baggage. You can't ignore it, but you also can't avoid it. And I've never forgotten this. This is about 25 years ago, and I thought, what do you mean this is how you express your femininity? You're a female person making work right now. As far as I know, you've never been anything other than a female person. So everything you make is going to be informed by that, whether it's made of clay or steel or stitchery.
Would anyone else like to add to that comment or express anything else that you're thinking about with regard to gendered lens or going beyond it? Okay, on that note, we turn to you.
Let me just say.
Yes.
At this point in the evening, we're going to take questions from the audience for our panel. I want to thank everybody up here. I personally thought it was fascinating. I also want to thank, which I forgot to do before, my fellow events committee members, Karen Schifano, who worked these questions, of course, Jerry we turn to you in the audience. If there's something that you would like to ask one of our panelists, we'll come around with the microphone.
Don't be shy.
Just raise your hand if you have a question. Don't be intimidated. Come on.
Or a comment.
Okay, hold on.
Adrienne.
Hi, I'd like a little more elucidation perhaps on the concept or question of participating in a show because you belong there or because you qualify for some category, such as gender, for example.
Our curator. That's the one who brought it up, so I guess I have to. Okay, you guys. Because there has been so much discussion recently about museum staffs, about exhibitions, which do not represent that magical, all-encompassing word, diversity. We've seen it. Exhibitions of artists who seem to be fulfilling certain requirements. Our mayor has said that unless museum staffs reflect the makeup of the city, we're not going to qualify for money. And that has meant a kind of scramble for hiring people. One assumes they are good at what they do, and it's great that they're getting these jobs. But we hope that they're being hired because they're great at what they do. So it's obviously the pendulum, is going to have to swing one way before it can swing the other way. But there are questions that come to mind. They're not pretty, but it's part of the reality. And one does hope that people are included because of the excellence of their work or the excellence of their curatorial ability, and not because somebody said, well, if you don't hire somebody who comes from that background, we're not going to fund you. That's all.
Rebecca, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think a lot of the importance of your question too is, or what we thought about in organizing this exhibition is that it wasn't supposed to just be a show about women. I mean, that was never the organizing principle, was to be, this is a show about women artists. That was almost secondary in the thought process of, this is a show about abstraction. It is about the female members. It is about celebrating women who might be underrepresented or not recognized in the mainstream because they haven't been part of these conversations, but it is ultimately to show kind of the nature of abstraction. And one of the most brilliant points I like about the show is it kind of shows the timelessness of abstraction in a way that it's almost hard to date when you put these pieces in conversation next to each other. I mean, I think with the exception of Slobodkina, who is very constructivist in her piece here, you can put a Pearl Fine next to a Lynn Harlow or a Vera Vasic, and I think it's interesting that the conversations that come out of these kinds of things. And so I think it's very important if you're organizing a show that has these kinds of very loaded political, social statements, that it does come back to the art. It is in its essence all about the artwork and the artist.
Thank you. Yeah, I would just add to that. I think it's such a great question. And that balance for really thinking about artistic excellence is so important. I have to say, I have to think about the Judy Chicago essay in which she describes, studying art in the year 2000. It's fact that which she wrote in 1975. And it's kind of hysterical, right? You read it, I would teach it to my students, and it's about, how we will all be studying the works of these women artists, and that's it, and it will be, not so much a history as an history. And now, in this day and age, we know how far we have to come, and that we'll never actually get there, really. And we have to be aware of the structural obstacles that women artists have faced in terms of access to education, and training and exposure and critical reception, there is still work to be done. So, we might for now still be having exhibitions that are focused on women artists with the hope, perhaps the fantasy, that 20, 30, 50 years from now, my future students will say, or my children or my grandchildren will say, God, that was such a stupid thing to do. Why did you do that? Why on earth would you ever focus on just women artists? That's so discriminatory. Whatever it might be, right? We have to, that frame, that lens, we just don't know. So we have to do the work that we can do now in the hopes that it'll be obsolete in the future, hopefully.
Of course, but by then, the heterosexual white male might be the minority who's been marching on.
They already are.
But apropos Junior Chicago, of course, that she reduced Emily Dickinson in the dinner party to a set of sexual references on a plate. All of them.
And I think, that essentializing factor, right, is something to be mindful of.
Let's take another question. Oriane?
Hi. One thing that I haven't heard addressed, and also I just started 9th Street Women, so I don't know if this is addressed, but I'm wondering about how women as a sort of oppressed or underdog cohort, how much women artists historically and now are supporting each other versus being competitive and sort of hoarding resources.
Who would like to respond? Rebecca.
I kind of identify with that anecdote in particular because I had a similar experience happen to me when I first graduated, and then this was one of my first interviews in the real world at a big, blue chip New York gallery, and was interviewed by a woman, and through the course of the interview, she eventually asked, how did you get this interview? And from what I inferred from the tone and the idea behind the question was, you don't have the experience or the authority to interview for this kind of position. And I felt very demeaned, belittled by that statement. And, in the course of looking back, I remember looking her up, and she came from a very similar art historical background as me. But I think that it's interesting that, I come from the perspective of you are up the ladder and you turn around and you help the next person up. And I think that those small moments of experience are very enlightening and a moment of realization for you to hopefully never do that to another person. But overall, I think it's very important, like Emily talked about earlier, to find mentors and to find communities and people who are going to support you and lift you up in moments, because everyone will have them when you don't necessarily feel like you have the authority or the inclusiveness to belong or to be part of that conversation.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to add to that? Nancy?
I think so, because I think it's very much connected to the previous question about opportunities. And like I just said, I think that the problem is seeing any of this as a zero-sum game. I think it's conceivable, I can sort of believe this is also anecdotal, that the possibility of being generous has increased, over the past couple of decades and more. Maybe it's just something you figure out as you go along, that being generous actually is better for your own career enhancement than being selfish. It's something that I think at some point we all sort of get. It doesn't really help you to, hold on to your, little sort of handful of privilege. Spreading it around does tend to sort of increase the wealth for everyone. But, going back, and sorry, I do want to go back just for a moment to this question of whether exhibitions are being organized to fill categories. I have found that being encouraged, as we all have been over the past 10, 15, 20 years and more, to be more alert to deficiencies in who is being represented, under what circumstances, has only enhanced my understanding of some, I mean, this goes back to Linda Nochlin. It's not a problem with, whether or not women are making good art, it's whether or not institutions are supporting them. And the same is true for people who have been marginalized in every category. And there too, being generous is something that enhances, I think.
I have a question.
Wait.
Here, I'm right here, but. In terms of Karen, we were talking about Princenthal, and when you were speaking about Helen Frankenthaler and how they wanted to categorize her as an abstract expressionist, which was clearly very much a male type of male aesthetic at that time, how do you feel about women's aesthetics and things that are identified as female, in terms of craft and things being handmade? How do you think that has changed the aesthetics of the art world?
More hard question. The late Jean Goosen always used to say, no movements, only artists. And the more time I spend looking at work and thinking about work and organizing exhibitions and writing about it, the more I understand what it means. And it's all about individuals and unique individuals. So I'm very reluctant to generalize. Yes, there was the whole, downtown chest-beating machismo of abstract expressionism, but then there were also women who were painting just as boldly and for one reason or another might not have been getting the attention, might have held back in some way. It doesn't make their work come out of a different set of assumptions. So I'm reluctant to talk about the female aesthetic or even an abstract expressionist aesthetic. There are certain ideas which are current at various times, which are discussed by a lot of people. You start thinking maybe there is such a thing as a zeitgeist. But in the end, I keep coming back to no movements, just artists.
Comments, questions? We have a question over here, Karen.
I don't have the mic.
Here, take this. We're playing musical.
Well, this is this is a very specific question for Nancy. You had mentioned, it sounded a bit of a question of an exploration of artists and their relationship to spirituality. Do you want to elaborate on that sort of a general concept? Is that something you're moving towards, you're curious about, or writing about right now?
No, to the question of whether it's something that I am focusing on or have explored with any particular depth. But I do know that the Hilma af Klint show was by far the most popular show that the Museum has ever staged. And that it seems to have been, and this is something I pay very close attention to, especially popular with younger viewers. So, I think what that suggests is that we are on the cusp, or maybe past it, of recognizing that spirituality is an aspect of people's lives, and in particular of finding meaning in abstraction and in using an abstract language as a way to express some condition or state. That state or that condition often leads to the same places that spiritual inquiry does, and they're often tied. They certainly were for Agnes Martin.
It is 8 o'clock.
we can continue, but Nancy and Karen need to leave. So we're going to allow them to